Welcome, everyone. This is our last of the four learning series for the inaugural New Frontier Forum. You all have been a tremendous cohort. We've transformed to see the power in the room, in a virtual room, and the power of what all of you all have brought over these past 4 months. It's my real privilege to bring Scott Reich into the Forum Learning Series today. Scott is on the JFK Library Foundation Board of Advisors. It's been a real privilege to get to know with him and work with him on several projects in my time at the library. He's a next generation Kennedy fan and has embodied those principles in his own life. He teaches presidential communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He's on American Express's digital council team. He's been an entrepreneur. He's started nonprofits recently that we may talk about, and has really demonstrated this commitment to citizenship in his own community and political engagement. And there's nothing more powerful than to see people living out the values that President Kennedy embodied, and for us to come together around those. So I'm grateful that you're here, Scott. I'll also lift up, and we'll get into it probably a little bit more, but if you haven't seen Scott's book, The Power of Citizenship, it came out a few years ago, and really foresees a lot of the opportunities that we see in front of us, and also the needs. And so I'm grateful that Scott's here today. I look forward to your questions and opening the floor up in about 20 minutes, and discussing the New Frontier Summit after that. So thanks very much, and over to you, Scott.
Great. Well, thank you so much, James. I'm grateful for your friendship and your leadership. And as I'm sure everyone on the phone can attest, you do a really wonderful job, not only in engaging people with the president's legacy, but in helping to keep that legacy alive in fresh and innovative ways. So I commend you, and I'm delighted to be your friend as well. So I'll dive right in, and the intent of this, of course, is to be conversational, so I will be brief. And I hope that you'll have some comments or questions, and we can really engage in some dialogue for the better part of this hour. I titled the book The Power of Citizenship for a simple reason. The idea of President Kennedy's, sort of his mission, if you will, as president, I think, was to bring people around certain basic values that have guided successful societies since ancient times. And as many of you probably know, President Kennedy himself was a student of classical history, and in particular ancient Greece. And so sprinkled throughout many of his speeches, you'll see not only rhetorical devices that he borrows from the ancient Greeks, but also concepts that originated millennia before he led our country. So most obvious, perhaps, is the funeral oration that was delivered by Pericles in the 5th century BC. And for those of you familiar with antiquity, this was at the outset of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the two great city-states in ancient Greece. And as was the custom in Athens back then, at the end of each year, each season of battle, there would be a mass public funeral before the entire city, in which the living citizens would pay homage to those who had paid the ultimate sacrifice. And as was customary in ancient Athens, part of this funeral ceremony would be a eulogy delivered by the leading statesman of the day. And in 431 BC, this was the Athenian general, Pericles. And he gave a speech that was unique in some ways. It's memorialized in Thucydides' book on the history of the Peloponnesian War. And what's unique about this speech is that rather than memorializing and eulogizing the dead, he actually eulogizes the city of Athens. The notion being that all things flow into the city because of the city's greatness, and therefore it is incumbent upon individuals to live up to the ideals and to the legacy that they have inherited, so they can prove worthy of past generations and make themselves models to future ones. So immediately when I remember reading this speech, actually as a student in college, I remember thinking that seemed like the classical expression of President Kennedy's famous inaugural command that we should ask not what our country can do for us, but what we can do for our country. And in my experience in just in reading and in teaching, I always find that the further back in time that a president searches for inspiration, the further back in time that old thoughts guide new ones, the further forward the president is seeking to propel society. And so in this case, of course, when we're talking about 2,500 years, we're talking about reaching far back in time through certain timeless principles. And that's really what President Kennedy's administration and legacy is all about. It's about ideas that transcend the time and place in which he served in nonpartisan ways that can be applied in basically any time, in any age. And I think that's what makes his legacy so special and so relevant. And so I was inspired by this call to service, even though, of course, I wasn't alive for a number of years before the president died. But I take from his words inspiration because I really feel that they're applicable, especially now in times when our public discourse is so badly in need of the kind of rhetorical leadership and actual leadership that he embodied. So I figured for today, given it's a short set of comments, I'm just going to walk you through a few ideas that relate to this principle of citizenship and talk about how they essentially defined the new frontier. What I think is unique in particular about President Kennedy's speeches actually is that despite the substance changing from one speech to the next, they're all predicated on this basic notion that we owe something to one another and that we owe something to the land where we live and that we need to be giving back. And so if you think about each of the policy initiatives of his presidency, and if you think about each of the major speeches, you can strip out some of the specific details that are applicable to the particular time and place in which he delivers the addresses. But at the base of all of these speeches is this simple conception of citizenship, that we have these obligations. So in my book, I break this down into three different categories. The first is what I call an appeal to our pride. The idea being that in order to be a good citizen, in order to want to give back to society, we need to feel proud of who we are as a people, where we live, and that we desire to make contributions to sort of continue to lift up the community around us. The second is that one key ingredient of President Kennedy's emphasis on citizenship is not only that it's not partisan, but it's also not limited to America. And so when we look briefly at some of his challenges abroad that many of us are familiar with, we can see these ideas of citizenship borne out in those places too. And then, of course, the most important aspects of his presidency are when we bring these notions of citizenship home and apply them in the early 1960s to the issues of civil rights, to increasing the culture in the United States, and so on. So that first bucket, appeal to our pride. I put a few different initiatives in this category, the first being the Peace Corps. Those of you who know the origination of the Peace Corps know that it did not begin, the idea of it was not President Kennedy's. Hubert Humphrey and others had talked about it for the couple of years leading up to the 1960 campaign, but Kennedy adopted it, gave a speech at the University of Michigan calling for volunteers, and March 1st, 1961, by executive order, he established the Peace Corps. I call attention to this initiative first because it's something that we're all familiar with. It's something that still exists. It's been funded by administrations, Democrat, Republican, and ever since, because we have accepted this as part of who we are as a country, in which we export some of the most important talents and resources that we have in our young people overseas for the benefit of other societies. And it's Kennedy promoting this notion that those of us who are privileged, those of us who have the opportunity to come up in a land like the United States, have an obligation, a responsibility to give back. But one thing I want to highlight here is that when you think about the number of people who have served in the Peace Corps, and it's a larger number at this point, we're still talking tens of thousands of people. My point being that this is something that is largely aspirational for 99.9% of the American population, meaning that we are holding this up simply as an example of how we can ask what we can do something for our country, right? So that's one piece. The financial cost is not significant either. It's about increasing the level of pride that we feel as a necessary ingredient for good citizenship. Another example is the Alliance for Progress that you may be familiar with, which was essentially an extension of FDR's good neighbor policy of the 1930s. And the idea here was to help democratize the region, improve literacy rates, improve and expand access to food and good education and land ownership. And this program lasted for a number of years and had some success too, again, principled on this notion that we belong to a community larger than ourselves. And if we have the obligation to help our neighbors, then we ought to do so. And of course, the biggest thing in this idea of appealing to our pride is the space race. And for those of you historians, we're on the heels of the latest anniversary, September 12th, of President Kennedy's famous speech at Rice University, in which he talks not only about the goal of landing a man on the moon, which he had already announced, but talking about how important it is for us as a society, as a civilization, to push the world forward and to seek enlightenment and progress. And one thing that Kennedy recognized and says in this speech is that there's some sort of glimpse into the eternal when we go into space, right? Because when we look back at Earth, this small planet, through these windows of space, we don't see national borders. We don't see differences in terms of labels, in terms of the color of our skin, our socioeconomic status, or really anything other than, right, land and water. And so the idea is that this provides a better perspective. And despite the fact that we are at the peak of the Cold War at this period, Kennedy is actually going around and suggesting that we cooperate with the Soviets in the quest to conquer and explore space. Why? Because when we think about this idea of planet Earth and humankind, it really is a small community. And so when we go into space, we ought to be going together. The second bucket I mentioned is this idea of challenges abroad. And for those of you who are familiar with the history, of course, there's the Bay of Pigs, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy's seeking to establish common ground with Khrushchev. He also gets into a famous speech the day before his famous civil rights speech, where he's speaking at American University, June 10, 1963, and advances what becomes known as the Kennedy detente, in which he essentially says that we ought to look at the Soviets and recognize that, yes, we want them to change their minds about certain issues, but all of us ought to be looking inward too, to consider how can we be doing better? What else can we be doing to advance this notion of citizenship, this idea of global citizenship? And it's something that actually resonated with Khrushchev and the Soviets. And in fact, the state press was basically gave the most favorable praise for any of Kennedy's speeches for that particular speech, because it established a framework that would allow the countries to coexist and compete peacefully, which, of course, Vietnam is lurking in the distance. There had been the battles over Berlin already, issues in Laos, and so on. And this is all sort of capstoned in the speech that Kennedy gives in Berlin, June 26th of 1963, in which he gives the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, saying that we are all Berliners, which, when you break it down, means that we are all part of something bigger than ourselves. We all connect with one another. We are all citizens of something, and that means we belong to something larger than who we are, that necessitates in return some of our actions and contributions. And the third bucket is the home front, the issues that Kennedy cares most about. The first example I'll share is the steel crisis of April 1962. The background here is that the economy had been coming out of a recession early in his presidency. There was concern about inflation, and there was a lot of conflict in the steel industry, which was considered a bellwether industry for the American economy at the time. And organized labor was looking for increased fringe benefits and increased overtime pay and so forth. And at the same time, the industry was seeking to increase prices to the consumer, but without raising wages. And Kennedy helped broker a behind-the-scenes deal. And just as it was about to be announced, some steel executives ended up reneging on it, announced increases on the prices, and none of the capitulations to organized labor. So Kennedy used one of his favorite tools, the live press conference that he made famous. He averaged one about every 16 days throughout his presidency, really making it a personalized experience in ways that it had never been before. And in this famous press conference, he comes out and basically says that for every example of citizenship that we extol, and which he talked about in his inaugural, there are counterexamples of bad citizenship, and essentially labels the greed of corporate executives as not acting in the best interest of the country. And they need to be rethinking how they're going to be acting. Otherwise, the government's going to essentially investigate them and require that they change their practices. The executives quickly backed down, created some long-lasting phrase, frankly, till his death, between Kennedy and the business community. But nonetheless, the point remains that Kennedy was seeking to emphasize that there is a notion of public responsibility, regardless of what role we are in, even if it's in the pursuit of private profit, that we need to be thinking about the public arena and what sorts of obligations we have to those around us. Another key component of the Kennedy presidency is the revival of culture. So we had the restoration of the White House that the First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, organized. with a televised tour that had an audience of some 75 million people. There were Pablo Casals hadn't performed in the White House. He's a famous cellist since 1904 when Teddy Roosevelt was president. They invited him back. Shakespeare's plays were performed there. And a big part of this was the notion that in the ancient world, what made a place like Athens or a place like Rome so powerful, so important, was not only its military and economic might, but also its cultural might. And so under President Kennedy's leadership, the country was going to be focusing on poetry, on music, on art, and all sorts of aspects that increase the social awareness and value of what it means to be a citizen in this great land. And naturally, the most important aspect of his presidency, the pinnacle of it, starts to really take off in the spring and summer of 1963, when he really publicly embraces the civil rights movement. For those of you familiar with Kennedy's stances during the 1960 campaign trail, he had talked often about prohibiting the discrimination in federal housing that was rampant at the time with the stroke of a pen. It would be an executive order. And yet when he became president, he didn't take this action, prompting members of the Black community to send pens symbolically to the White House to remind him of his campaign pledge. Privately, Kennedy had been very sympathetic to the civil rights movement, and by the time the spring of '63 rolls around, he had already dealt with integration at the University of Mississippi, and there was a looming crisis at the University of Alabama and Governor George Wallace. And here, Kennedy winds up using the full powers of the presidency and the office by speaking live to the American people the evening of June 11, 1963. And this is one of the reasons that I find President Kennedy so heroic, which is that his speech draft was not actually even finalized by the time the cameras began rolling live, but so internalized had become the message of citizenship and equal rights that it came second nature to him. And so he spoke about this idea that the issue of civil rights is as clear as the American Constitution, he said. And this is not just a question of, people in a particular region of the country who are not thinking morally upright ways. He said, this is a challenge for all of us to be thinking about the prejudice that we experience, the prejudice that we propagate, and to do better as a nation. And it's all premised on this basic notion that we are part of something together and we owe something to one another. So I've given a very high-level overview, partly of my book, but partly how I see the faces of the new frontier developing over the period from January 1961 to November '63. And of course, it's a shame that President Kennedy died, so early in his presidency, when there was so much more to be done. But I also think in some odd ways, it allows us to use our imagination and think about how much more could have been done had he been able to live and pursue some of these initiatives. It invites questions around what would have happened to civil rights. How quickly would it have developed? On what basis? How would things in Vietnam have gone forward? What other mutual understandings would he have been able to potentially make with Khrushchev that might have altered the course of the Cold War? So of course, there are no answers to these questions. We can just think about what may have been. But to me, what is most compelling about this legacy is this idea that we can connect with Kennedy, regardless of which generation is alive and regardless of what our issues are, because what he endeavored to impart in the American people, in the citizenry, was this idea that we need to focus our priorities on things that bring us together. And it's not just for unity's sake, it's because, in his words, a rising tide lifts all boats. The idea that we can help one another and advance our community is perhaps the best way to also advance our personal lives. And what I think is most interesting about Kennedy's legacy all these years later is that there are still no answers necessarily that he offers to today's problems, but that's okay, because what he focuses on is training Americans to think about how we can answer difficult questions, how we can use this framework of citizenship to guide us regardless of what circumstances surround us. And so for me personally, when I think about where we are as a country today, politically and historically, not just in the presidency, but in our cultural dialogue, in the way we have, it seems, departed from a lot of the values of that era, it's easy to feel nostalgic, but there's also something proactive that we can do. And this is what I decided to write about, and this is part of what I teach at Penn, is that we can reach back in time for guidance on where we ought to be going forward today. And so, we're at a point in time where there are now more Americans alive who were born after Kennedy died than there are people who were living when he was president. And so that means pretty pointedly that it's up to the people on this phone call and other Zooms like this to be thinking about how we carry this legacy and the ideals that guided his presidency forward into the next generation, so that we can, basically use this framework to build upon and get this country moving again, in his words, and ready for the next generation to inherit something better than we have inherited. So I'm getting a message from James that our time for the initial chat is getting ready to transition. So James, I'll turn it back to you to either ask questions of the audience, or if you'd like to kick it off yourself.
Sure, Scott. Thank you. One of the things that we've discussed is how to take the principles in history and jumpstart that for new generations today that were not alive during President Kennedy's lifetime and may not have the same historical education that you've lifted up as such a value for today. What have you found as you meet with audiences, as you teach? What is it that helps people embody and take on these values with confidence and courage in their own lives?
I think it's a couple of things, James, and it's a good wide-ranging question. I think one thing is that hearing the president's words is always inspirational for people. And so being able to connect with his speeches and connecting with what they might mean for us today is always a valuable exercise, I find, when we can show speech excerpts and clips to sort of set the table and connect ourselves with the president. But the more basic thing, I think, is to try to gain a very basic historical knowledge about who we were as a country at that time. So let's talk about society in the early 1960s for a moment. We had an educational system that taught classes like home economics and Western Civ. We had Rotary clubs and other citizen-based volunteer initiatives that were grassroots in a lot of communities. And it's of course not to say that we don't have that today, but those organizations have evolved over time. And what we teach in our schools has also changed. And so I think that one thing to highlight is that we need to be bringing back into our public discourse some aspects of society that were very commonplace back then, which was, the family dinner and being able to move off of technology, which naturally didn't exist in the same ways back then, so that we can bring ourselves together around conversation, around connecting with other people, because that's really what the Kennedy presidency is about. And when we look at the specific issues that he sought to address during the New Frontier, we see that those issues are still the issues that we're talking about. He looked at immigration, we're focused on immigration. He looked at healthcare, we're focused on healthcare. Jobs, international conflict. And it's easy to say, yes, perhaps every president looks at these issues. But if you look at the way Kennedy frames the issues across all of these things, he's talking about it on this basis of public responsibility. And I think that if we can try to connect that message, that's something that resonates with people today, because when we get out of the nitty gritty of the issues that may divide us today and we focus on what kinds of things should we be doing as individuals in terms of holding things up in our community and picking one another up, it becomes a little bit easier to recognize people who may have differences from us and focus on the things that bring us together. So I would say that the thing that I try to focus on and that I find resonates the most is when we try to connect some of these issues with the basic values that we want to guide us, rather than the he said, she said game or which cable network somebody gets their news from.
I think in addition to that, Scott, and your talk today lifts up that sense of place, that embodiment of where citizenship brings us together. It's also when we see people acting out those values and when we come together. And you and I have had several conversations over the past year, and we talked about whether you might want to share a little bit today about what you've been doing for your son, Eli. And I'd frame it as an example. The year of COVID has been a nightmare year for so many of us, and not what we expected. And seeing President Kennedy's high aspirational rhetoric in the light of real challenges totally gives a fresh view to what astronaut, to what moonshots may be. But I wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit about what your family has gone through and what you've done in response as a way of thinking about how President Kennedy's legacy, if we take on those values, gives us some guideposts to think about moving through the challenges.
Sure. Well, James, I appreciate the question, and for the audience to share a little bit more color. I have two children, and my son Eli is about 16 months old, and was diagnosed with a very rare and severe brain condition called FOXG1 syndrome, which most people have not heard of. And we got the diagnosis about a year ago this week, actually. And for the last year, during COVID, we've been focusing on therapies and, and trying to support him as best we can, because he's unfortunately not expected to walk or talk, and he's at high risk for seizures and has a number of other complications. So it's a pretty debilitating situation for everybody involved. But one thing that has come out of this is that my wife Alyssa and I decided that we didn't want to just accept the prognosis. We decided that we wanted to fight to change the anticipated outcome. And so late last year, we formed a nonprofit and got our 501c3 status called Believe in a Cure. And if you're interested, you could visit our website, which is webelieveinaCure.org, webelieveinaCure.org. And what we are doing in a nonprofit capacity is funding cutting edge research at a lot of institutions that will benefit not only our son Eli, but people, anybody who's impacted by this condition. And what's interesting actually is, despite the rarity of this condition, there's only about 700 known cases in the entire world. This gene, FOXG1, actually has established scientific links to Alzheimer's and schizophrenia, brain tumors, and it's on the autism spectrum. And so many scientists believe that this gene is one of those potential keys to unlocking a lot of other incredibly important knowledge that could help how we treat some of these other conditions. So obviously, I don't have President Kennedy whispering in my ear saying, do this or do that. But I think that it's safe to say that that spirit of wanting to make a difference in the lives of not just Eli, but the others impacted who may not have the same ability to make a difference, or, we're really talking about giving a voice to the voiceless. And so for us, we're motivated naturally by our son, but also by the idea that we can potentially, dramatically change how sciences and drug development occurs for certain kinds of conditions. So, I sort of joke around because I've never really been like a big science guy. I took environmental studies 100 in college just to satisfy a requirement. But we've had to become together like a science team and a biotech team. And I'm a lawyer by trade, as you heard earlier. And so I've had to become a little bit of a biotech lawyer. And so Alyssa and I are just very focused on how do we take the circumstances that were given to us and fulfill what we feel like is our obligation, not only as parents, but as citizens. I mean, we're individuals who have a cause, and like so many other people, we try to channel our energy into productive and constructive things. And so we're still in this process and, fundraising, but we've got a number of projects going at Harvard and MIT and other great institutions. And so we're hopeful in the next, coming months that we'll have something to help push this community forward.
Scott, I think of our time together at the JFK Space Summit last year in the pavilion, and if any of you all have been to the pavilion in the library, those of you have, it's the scaffolding of an unfinished life and the "let us begin" quote. And all these things won't be finished in the first 100 days or the lifetime of this administration, but let us begin. And you've modeled to me a complete pivot without missing a beat of doing what you have to do. And President Kennedy in the pavilion also says that that's the basis of human morality. So you've demonstrated and modeled such an inspiring example for me, and I'm grateful to you for it. I'd love to open up questions to other folks, and I'll ask one last one to transition a little bit, Scott. At American Express, you've talked to large groups of employees And I'm curious how you approach that from the corporate audience standpoint, and what you found your colleagues across ages, what were some of the themes that they came back to you and said were meaningful?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on how recently, some of the events have been. I recently moderated a discussion in front of a nice sized audience that internally at American Express, where we talked about race relations and racial equity and social justice. And so this was, a little bit of less of a focus, obviously, on Kennedy. But I think that in the corporate context, that this idea of citizenship is perhaps, more important than in many other places, only because this is a place where there's a dedicated hierarchy, and we need people at the top of these organizations to create a leadership model that allows people to be comfortable in who they are, and to enable people to engage in constructive dialogue in ways that are appropriate in these settings, because we need people to feel comfortable being who they are, and everyone brings a different perspective to the work life. And so, how we most of us who work obviously work a lot of hours. It's a majority of our time for the week. And so we have to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose there. And I think one means of achieving that sense of purpose is making people feel safe and creating an environment where people can engage in dialogue about the issues that are around us, and not pretend that we're just within a bubble during the work hours and that, we go back to life afterward. So I think that's just the idea of even discussing difficult issues is a big factor. But I also think that people in the corporate setting are appreciative of, just talking about historical context. And in the example of President Kennedy's legacy, there's always a big level of interest, because I think people remember, if they were alive, they either remember him fondly, or if they were not alive, they remember that their parents or other people of importance to them, their teachers perhaps, speak of President Kennedy with a certain kind of reverence. And so there's some transcendent element to it, and listening to him, especially because I think he bridges the partisan divide. You have many Republicans quote from his speeches, just of course as many Democrats do.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I think it's good to give a moment to pause and absorb some of these things too. So,
well, while people are noodling on that, if there's anything they'd like to ask, one thing I would just share about the class that I'm involved with at Penn is, James had mentioned a course on presidential communication, and I just wanted to share to make you all aware of this, because it's kind of a cool program that we have. There's one course assignment for each student in the class each semester, and it's to write a minimum 30-page paper on any topic of presidential communication that interests them. And we have the funding to give students stipends to visit the presidential libraries of their choice, so they can do research, in the archives. So right now, naturally, things are a little bit, atypical, and we can't send students. But I share this because we're trying to make history come alive in unique ways. And as one of my mentors once said to me about what is the need for presidential libraries, he sort of likened it to, there are two ways that you can see Paris. You can go to Epcot Center, or you can go to France. And so the idea being that there's something magical, as you all know, about being in the library and having that aura surround you. And I just wanted to share that we're trying to create some of that magic by allowing students to get into the, not just mindset, but the physical space where they can feel transported to a different era. And that's why the work of the library in my personal life, from teaching, is actually so critical, because we're blessed to send students to the Kennedy Library every semester who are very focused on understanding new pieces of the president's legacy.
Marianne.
Yeah, I have a question, Scott. Thank you so much. That was lovely. And I'm so awed and admiring of how you've handled your son's diagnosis. It's really inspirational. So thank you for being an inspiration to us.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, how are you handling, both at school and with your students, and just in your own mind, about this idea that we're actually facing history maybe for the first time. You know, the James Baldwin quote that white people are trapped in a history they don't understand.
Yeah.
I'm seeing amongst my colleagues, and I'm actually facilitating a few groups of folks who are trying to dive into this stuff, but I think we, those of us who are white and those of us who have had privilege or whatever, are really looking into the whitewashing of the history we've been fed over a lifetime.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how is that coming up in your classes, and how are you struggling with it and all of that?
Sure. Oh, it's a great question, and I appreciate you raising it. And I don't think it's an easy question, as our society can sort of confirm through what we're discussing. Obviously, there's a lot around us in terms of race relations and a lot of the challenges that are, that have always been here, but have come more to light because we haven't gone as far as we need to go, of course. And we see statues being pulled down and questions around different monuments and so forth. So I think that actually is probably the answer to the question, which is that in the academic setting, at least, we're talking about the way we're engaging is by talking about these things, and by as a first step, simply acknowledging some of the things that you noted in your statement in question, which is that there is no way that a white person can fully understand the plight and experience and perspective of a person of color who has been, subject to discrimination or had fear of certain things that a white person walking down the street may not worry about. So I think that's the first step. And then, the next step is talking about being an ally. And I think an ally is not somebody who is simply not a racist or not somebody who, engages in destructive activity, but somebody who actually takes a proactive stance to stand with other people who are fighting for the right causes in their view. So one way, and you actually touched on something that really resonates with me, and it's something that I'm considering writing about actually for a future book, which is that this idea of accepted history is one that we really need to wrestle with. And it's not just about whitewashing, it's just about sort of going back and seeing, okay, what about our processes, what about how we even frame history needs to be revisited. And it's not purely rewriting a history textbook, of course. It's much broader than that, and thinking about the perspectives that we bring and what topics we cover and how those topics are covered, and probably most important, who is involved in crafting that messaging and what those books look like and what the curricula in different classes is designed to be. So I think that's a key component of it. But what I'm looking to consider writing about is this notion that every generation is fed some kind of, sanitized story version of something that is done in a way to serve a certain purpose. Maybe it's to maintain status quo, maybe it's to invite change, or something in between. But the question is, how do we take this accepted history and play around with it? And so one of the things that I connect this to actually is how we look at our monuments. So when you think about the memorials and monuments that we have in Washington, D.C. in particular, think about, why did those monuments and memorials get built? Were they built, as sort of really a backward-looking set of praise for someone's actions, or were they built with a forward-thinking mindset of, we need to use these monuments, the messages, the legacies that we're trying to symbolize here, as inspiration for how we ought to move forward as a society? And I think we're certainly grappling with this, as you and everyone else knows right now, with when we think about, there are certain things that we may say, well, it's reasonable to take down this horse statue of this particular figure. But where do we draw the line, and how slippery does the slope become? So as an example, there have been multiple debates in different cities and, with different outcomes of taking down statues of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. And there have been simultaneous discussions around other figures. So for example, Nathan Bedford Forrest, another Confederate general. And so then the question becomes, are they both the same degree of bad, so to speak, because they were on the Confederacy? And, does it matter what they did after the war? And I'm not taking a position here. I'm simply pointing out that there's an interesting discussion to be had, because Robert E. Lee becomes the president of the college that becomes Washington and Lee, and actually promotes in his post-war life until his death, a reunification of the country culturally, politically, and so on. And Nathan Bedford Forrest becomes a leader of the local KKK. Should they be treated the same? I'm not answering that here, but those are the questions that we need to be thinking about. And to what extent should we whitewash all history? Because there are some aspects of it that we still need to tell the story. And I think that our society continues to wrestle with this, and we have these discussions in class sometimes. So hopefully
Thanks.
Scott, Doris Kearns Goodwin's leadership, I remember her speaking about the four guys, the four presidents she studied, and she talked about how each one of them modeled and perfected the communication medium of their time. Lincoln with speeches, Roosevelt with the radio, and then moving on up, we could think about the success of President Trump as a Twitter president. Because you work in digital, I'd be curious to hear you speak about the frontier of media and communication, and how might we continue to use virtual forum sessions, collaborative learning spaces. How can new leaders create inclusive opportunities and ways to bring people together? Because it does seem that technology can divide us and isolate us as a paradox.
I thought you were going to conclude with I thought you were going to wind up with some kind of softball, because that's a pretty complex question. I think that there's no clear. It
wasn't mine. It was from the audience. The audience.
Well, I'm teasing. It's a great question because it highlights for us, some of the key issues of our time. I think that in many ways, of course, COVID has been very challenging. But one thing that I've seen, certainly even in the scientific world, is that people to whom you might not be able to get access are accessible these days, and people are willing to do things because they don't have to travel, and they're not in an office where they have 47 million things going on during the day that they can't make time. So I actually think that in some way it has allowed us to engage with people in ways that we would not otherwise have done. I find in my business, my professional work, for example, that calls that I used to make by phone, just because if I wasn't in the office with a person, we would talk on the phone, right? We wouldn't do a Zoom or a WebEx or whatever. Now, if someone's like, hey, I want to chat, the default is let's do a Zoom so we can see one another when we're speaking. So I actually think that the communication has changed a little bit. But the bigger thing that this highlights is that we need a democratization of this entire idea of access to technology, because those of us who are on the phone or on this Zoom are looking on computers or smartphones and able to access this, when a large swaths, I should say, of our population don't have the benefit of this. And we have to think continually about the differences between urban and suburban settings. And we need to think about schools that are under-resourced versus those that are in affluent areas. And what does that mean for our children? Because, the idea of a virtual education for somebody in an affluent neighborhood is going to be very different from somebody who has limited resources and, perhaps not even the professional capacity at the school to create the kind of environment that would be conducive to learning. So this is creating, in my opinion, while sometimes it's giving more access, it could also potentially lead to a widening of some of the gaps, which is really unfortunate. And it's going to require our colleges and universities to think through how we can take this into account when we accept students from different backgrounds and what kind of access they may have had during their sophomore and junior and potentially senior years, depending on how old kids are. So I think, what role can we play here is a difficult question, because I don't have the ability, nor do you, to say, well, like this, let me just fix some of these issues. But what I think that we can do is try to be aware of these issues. And for those of us who are in positions of influence, who may be serving on a school board or who may sit on a committee of some kind, we just need to be thinking about how to look at these issues through multiple lenses. And we're all prejudiced at the end of the day, because we've all had certain experiences that shape how we view the world. And I think that what recent times, and I think something that President Kennedy asked us to consider, is how do we think about things from the perspective of another person, especially when it's a person with whom we have limited familiarity. And there's no question that people are just generally, by nature, are a little scared of the unknown. But I think that what this has allowed us to do, or I hope will promote us to do further, is to think through what can we do with technology that will open these doors and make things a little bit more comfortable to engage with the uncomfortable. And technology can play a role, because with this expanded access in certain areas, we need to be using it for the kinds of purposes that will advance, these aims.
Scott, the New Frontier Forum has been an attempt to innovate in some ways and to create more opportunity for people to come together and create, through principles of trust, a way for people to have that safe space you talked about, and really lean into conversations. And I think we're just beginning in some ways. And I'm so grateful to you today. I want to plug your book and read one last quote for my final words. I'm happy for you to have the last thought, and then we're going to turn over, and I'm just going to share some things about the New Frontier Summit coming up on September 25th and having people involved in that. But thank you again. You embody, you bring so much, and it's even more inspiring to see someone who's living every day today in the way that you are, and you've shared so much, both with the presidency and personally. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
So if you've gotten the Power of Citizenship, this is the end of my quote that I started for you. It's our responsibility to embrace the spirit of the new frontier in our own lives so we can meet the challenges of our time. It is a time to embrace our obligations as citizens so we can take action and embody the spirit of service our country needs. Thank you so much again, Scott. We're looking forward to the discussions that follow this week in the forum and the New Frontier Summit coming up September 25th that I hope you'll be able to join us for too. Thank you very much.